everybody, welcome to episode 5 of Against Everyone with Connor Habib. I'm Connor Habib. Thank you for supporting the show on Patreon. It's patreon.com/Connor Habib if you don't do that. This episode is called The Astronaut'S Thumb. And I'm going in this episode to talk about fundamental changes to our perception and consciousness, and the focus of those changes being time and space. Don't worry, I promise it'll all make sense and it'll be an exciting journey through all of this. One of the reasons why I want to talk about time and space is I like talking about things that affect all of us. So like the last episode where I gave a lecture was about work. Obviously, time and space relates to all of us. And as I go forward with this, I want to say I'm not going to do something that really irritates the fuck out of me when people talk about consciousness and fundamentals of consciousness, which is they often defer to brain mapping and neuroscience and evolutionary biology, like how our brain is hardwired to like Richard Dawkins's butt or whatever, the evolutionary science behind Aquaman's orange t-shirt, whatever the fuck. I hate stuff like that because I think there are so many more currents going on than just these materialistic ones that are often based on flawed models of evolution, bad ideas about economics, and reductive ideas about how all our mind and thinking is really just completely related to the brain. I'll talk about all those gripes in future episodes because they keep coming up for me. But my approach is always to say, okay, the science stuff is cool and important and it's interesting to bring in. But hey, maybe philosophy is important as well. Maybe spirituality and culture and art and desires and sex, all that stuff, maybe that has something to offer here. As a result, I want you to know when I talk about technology, which I'm going to do quite a bit in this episode, I don't think that technology is the driving force of change. I think it's a symptom of changes in our consciousness. The consciousness aspect is a sort of main event, and the technology stuff is the kind of sideshow that arises out of the main event. Okay, so time and space. Let's do this. My idea is that we have a reassessment and a new engagement going on with time and space itself, that we're changing how we interact with it, and it's changing as well. And I don't just mean we have a new Brian Greene book about it, and we have some idea about it that's different. I mean, actually being human and our experience of time and space is changing. You might be thinking, all right, Connor, what the fuck? We're not at Burning Man. What are you talking about? Let me bring in an example, a historical example that will show you a time when this changed before, when we had a fundamental shift in consciousness relating to space. And I'm going to quote this European philosopher, Jean Gebser, who investigated all this. Gebser was really interested in looking at fundamental changes in consciousness, like the one I'm talking about. He called them mutations in a very X-Men kind of way. And he said that you could observe them by examining these moments in history and seeing these great shifts. And he does a lot of this in this huge book called The Ever-Present Origin, which is awesome, but it's also very big. So let's see if I can give you a little bit of a summary here, and then you can investigate more on your own. He said, the last time we had this reassessment of space was in and around the 15th to 16th century. You can see huge changes in dimensionality and responses to space and conceptions of space in that time. For instance, in Western art prior to that time, there was this sort of presiding flatness. Things were much less dimensional, and then suddenly there was perspective in painting. Landscapes kind of took over. And Gebser's point is that perspective in our consciousness is, that itself changed in consciousness to allow for the perspectives in painting. It wasn't like we just got this new cool art idea. Actually, something was happening at the consciousness level. And one of the things that he's really good at is showing how that's so and how you can see it, because it wasn't just in art. I mean, if you just gave one example, who gives a shit? But he ties in all these examples and says, no, this was this actual cultural wide shift. And it was in relation to space. So I'm going to give a quote here. It's a little bit of a dense quote, but it's also a pretty thrilling ride. So stick with it. And it's a very profound observation. So Here's Jean Gebser talking about the liberation of space and the discovery of a new dimensionality. I'll read it slow so we can keep up with Gebser together. Leonardo da Vinci presents the first truly scientific and not merely theoretical description of all possible types of perspective. Space is the insistent concern of Leonardo's era. At the very moment when Leonardo discovers space and solves the problem of perspective, thereby creating the possibility for spatial objectification in painting, other events occur which parallel his discovery. Copernicus, for example, shatters the limits of the geocentric sky and discovers heliocentric space. Columbus goes beyond the encompassing oceanos and discovers Earth's space. Vesalius, the first major anatomist, bursts the confines of Galen's ancient doctrines of the human body and discovers the body's space. Harvey destroys the precepts of Hippocrates' humoral medicine and reveals the circulatory system. This intense desire, evident at the turn of the 16th century, to conquer space and to break through the flat ancient cavern wall, is exemplified not only by the transition from sacred fresco painting to that on canvas, but even by the most minute and mundane endeavors. It was around this time that lace was first introduced. And here we see that even the fabric could no longer serve merely as a surface, but had to be broken open, as it were, to reveal the visibility of the background or substratum. The previous unity breaks apart. Not only is the world segmented and fragmented, but the age of colonialism and the other divisions begins. Schisms and splits in the church, conquest and power politics, unbounded technology, and all types of emancipations. All right, it's a pretty intense quote, I would say. I love it. I think it's important to point out that now we have a new reassessment of space going on too, and a reassessment of time. We can see the early stirrings of this, I think, with the moon landing in 1969. So can you imagine the fucking intensity of seeing this concept, this concept you had of a globe, but experiencing it with your senses? So you land on the moon and you see the globe. Can you imagine the shock of that? There's this great story that Neil Armstrong held up his thumb and he said, "Everything I've ever known is behind my thumb right now." That moment might not have been the start of this new assessment of space, but it's certainly a huge one to point to. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. Here are three. First, seeing the Earth, experiencing the totality of human existence, except in Armstrong's case, his own, of course, he was on the moon. He saw the totality of human existence right there on the planet. It was all there behind his thumb. Second, being able to blot it out because he was removed from it. In other words, he wasn't there. So for the first time ever, he could blot all that out with his thumb. And third, knowing that it was contained behind his thumb. For me, I think what could be a more perfect illustration of our moment and how we relate to space and also time? The accessibility of all space with my thumb. See, when I communicate with people, I use my thumb very fast. And if you're listening, I'm holding up my devilish device, my cell phone right now, tapping it with my thumb. My thumb, the astronaut's thumb, is moving. I dedicate more time to expanding space by not going anywhere. It's not travel, but it's simulation. I sit and I find space, different places, different things, restaurants, countries, travel plans, under my thumb. It's all behind my thumb. Open space is less available to people now, right? So most people live in cities, so open space, the normal conception of wide open space, the expanse, is no longer really available. I mean, not many people live in places like Wyoming anymore as much as they live in cities, for instance. The horizon is blocked. And when we work, increasingly, we don't have that open space either. I talked about this in the last episode, in episode 3. We rely, again, on our hands in a limited space. That, the nature of work is changing, so we're not having this spatial variation of the field of labor where we're going out and doing all these things with our bodies. Some people are, of course, but increasingly, we're more and more stationary, and just our fingers are moving, and maybe our eyeballs. So our fingers and our eyes, all right? The fingers are typing or deleting the world right in front of you. We can travel, of course, but when we travel, we sit, like we sit at work, in a space, stationary. There's a car or a plane, and that takes us to another space. It's like that old Kurt Vonnegut joke where he says that when you get in an elevator, how do you know that that machine isn't just reorganizing matter outside of you, space and matter outside of you, and then when the doors open, you're entering into that. That's what it's like to travel. We get in this sort of weird space transmogrifying machine, We don't have the same feeling as traveling through space like we did before. We get in, we sit, and it moves for us, right? And right now we're working on, and just slowly coming out, these driverless cars. So we're not even going to have that experience of driving and using our feet in the same ways anymore, and our hands and our eyes and our instincts. We'll probably just more and more be using our phones and our computers while we're in our car. So we'll just get in the Tesla and let that, rearrange space for us, and then we'll open it up and be somewhere else. So these are some of the ways in which space is changing for us. I mean, it's interesting. The world may feel more accessible to us. We feel we have global access. The moon landing started this. Then economic globalization, NAFTA, all that shit, the internet. But our range of motion is decreasing. Our spatial dimensionality is decreasing. We're just not moving in the same ways that we used to. Space is expanding in a sense. We're getting more and more of it, but we're constantly contracting in a sort of compensation. It's like we're trying to become sort of centers of gravity so that space will become attracted to us by using our phones to access space, by using our computers, by sitting still. We're pulling space closer and closer to us so we can access more. So there's no surprise to me of that cliche with even though we have more access to the world, we feel more isolated. Because to have that access, we have to be isolated. We have to contract. We must, as it were, feel as if we're on the moon, beholding everything we know, but separate from it. So what does that mean? It means spatially our hands, and especially our fingers, and especially our thumbs, are more and more involved in our apprehension of space. We have this triangulated being. Here, if you're listening, I'm holding my cell phone up with two hands and looking at it. It's like a triangle. There's like my arms reached out and my fingers and my eyes sort of looking at the phone. It's our hands and our eyes. The rest of our body doesn't exist, but so much of our being is just in that little triangle. I mean, think about how much time you spend engaging with your eyes and your hands. And your phone is at the center of the triangle. It's like the glowing eye in the pyramid. The old version of space, the one that we walked through and worked in and hiked in, it's becoming strange to us. Have you noticed? It's sometimes even becoming unbearable. We all want this new version of space. I mean, remember those stories from like a couple of years ago, I think it was, of the people who were playing Pokémon Go and they were like walking off cliffs as they're looking at their phones. People are missing physical space. They're texting while they're driving, getting in accidents, or getting hit by cars, texting as they cross the street. It's like slapstick, but gone very, very wrong. People running into walls and falling down manholes and like stepping on the front of rakes so that the handle just like smacks them in the head. But it's not only that, space is increasingly unfavored by us without involving our hands and eyes. So it's not just the slapstick stuff. we're starting to prefer to interact with it with our hands and eyes. We photograph everything. We hold up the phone and we contain it by contracting it. Contain space by contracting it. We rectangularize it in a way. So we go to a meadow and we take a picture after picture of flowers. We go to a concert and we film it. We go to the Grand Canyon and we take selfies. We've started to rely on this new form of space triangulated by our hands and our devices. Things don't really have the same sense of reality unless they're framed, unless they're photographed, unless they're contained in this new organ, in some sense, that we've created. There's a legend of the first movie. I don't know if you all have ever heard of this, but it's like the first movie was made and there was a train and it was coming at the screen, or the first movie in a movie theater, and people went to this movie and they ran out screaming because they thought the train was going to come through the screen and hit them. Now, we can't see the train without the screen. We need to hold our lens up just to see the train. We might even miss one coming at us, trying to get Pokémon Go on some train tracks and get flattened, I don't know. Do people even play Pokémon Go anymore? I'm not sure. But again, the world, in some sense, has to fit into this new spatial organ that we have. And if space changes, time changes too. Time, after all, is made of layers of space. It's a higher dimensionality. It's composed of the lower dimensionality of space. So, a very simple, basic way that time is changing is just the dexterity of our hands. I use one finger to type on my phone more quickly than people used to be able to type at all. And of course, the speed of everyone's typing skills, the mass distribution of literally manual dexterity is changing. The speed of my hands in time has changed as I type on the keyboard. But also, I'm learning that time is changing. The past is becoming more accessible, and the future, may be becoming more accessible as well. There's this occult concept of something called the Akashic Record. The Akashic Record is, this idea that all the totality of all time, everything that's ever happened or been thought, every being, every person, every cell, every animal, every imagined instance is contained in this sort of spiritual field. That's a very simplistic way of describing it, but fine. And I believe that, we've willed or tried to seek to summon the Akashic Record into being because we haven't done the inner work to access it spiritually. What do I mean by this? That sounds a little weird, but, all technological advances are spiritual longings that we externalize. So think about planes. We wanted to fly, so we created planes. I mean, what could be more occult than wanting to fly? We want to communicate telepathically over space, so we create telephones. We want to have super strength, so we create forklifts to lift heavy shit, The internet stems from an occult longing too. We want to create an Akashic Record. So we spatialize all of time. We try to put everything that ever existed out there. So now the past is always present. It's always surrounding us. And if I'm right about the new type of spatialization, it's in us. We hold it in our hands a lot of times. There's this documentary called After Porn Ends. It's a terrible documentary, but it's sort of about how your porn past comes back to haunt you. Well, now there's no after porn anymore. If you're a porn performer, you're on the screen and then you're in the internet forever and people always see you. That's something that sex workers become acutely aware of when they start their careers, that all of time is sort of spatialized now. It's always available. Your identity isn't hideable in the same way. Another thing that's happening is that memory, our response to the past and time is changing, right? Because we're no longer bound to remember everything because of this sort of spatial representation of all time that's happening in the internet. We have a surplus of memory because it's all there. It's like, if we have calculators, we don't have to know how to do basic math. We have a device that can do that for us. So I'm wondering what this extra space of not needing to remember things, mental space, will give us. Time is also becoming contracted in a way that sort of mirrors space. I mean, we're contracting time. I mean, just think about it. You have status updates, tweets, not just social media, but checking your device all the time. I need to check my texts. I need to check this. I need to, look at my bank account and then, go back into my day. Things are becoming segmented in this almost sort of absurd flip book kind of way. You do something for 2 minutes, then you look at your phone for 10 minutes, then you do something for 5 more minutes, et cetera, et cetera. We're cataloging the present moment so much. It's almost like this Buddhist nightmare where the present is always present. In fact, we're so in it that the present is omnipresent. And it's not this mindfulness utopia that we're promised. Instead, it's this sort of obliteration of an old way of time. There are people that have still that old way of time in their lives. Farmers, people that read books for, read lots and lots of books, who just sit and do that, who meditate for long periods of time. They're sort of keepers of the old version of time. And people who can do that and the new stuff, they have this kind of cool knowledge, I think, right now. And we should strive to make the different kinds of time transparent to each other. And I think that these new kinds of time are producing all sorts of problems for us, whether it's anxiety, which is a kind of contracted, seized version of the future, right? It's so based in future thinking, anxiety, or the kind of inescapable presence of the world with space that depression causes. It's like, I've got nowhere to go. There's no way out. There's nowhere to escape to because it's all available to me right now. I think that the rise of anxiety and depression have a lot to do with our sort of coping mechanisms for this new kind of time, and this new kind of space. So I don't want to, be totally glum here. I don't think that these are negative developments. I think you can see them that way, of course, if you'd like to. But I think also we can see them as things that we've willed into happening for one reason or another. Maybe we're sort of overcoming the old versions of space and time, just like we did before in the 15th and 16th century when we started to notice perspective. Maybe we're in a moment right now where it's like the dimensionality is increasing, becoming more available to us, like the dot becoming the line, becoming the plane, becoming the cube. Maybe we've sort of internalized and overcome the old version of time because we want to explore a new dimension. We want to see what else is available to us. So let's think about this. Let's not run in terror. Let's explore it together. That's my hopeful note at the end of this episode. If you like the show, if you like what I'm doing, please do support my Patreon. Take a little time before you don't have any left and go to patreon.com/Conner Habib and support the show. That's it. I guess I'll see you, or not see you because we're not really in the same space, next time or whenever, because maybe you'll watch the next episode before you watch this one. See, it gets all very confusing. Thanks for hanging out.